Peter is one of Ireland's most distinguished public figures and, dare I say, benefactors as well in many unspoken ways. He's had an extremely varied career in politics, in business, and now in the service of the UN for the last 10 years or so. Peter was one of our most distinguished attorney generals in the early 80s, and he then, in the mid-80s, became Ireland's member of the European Commission with responsibility for competition policy. He, in the meantime, became chairman of Goldman Sachs and chairman of BP, and had a very varied business career. In 2006, the then Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, appointed Peter as his special representative on international migration, and he has held that post for the last 10 years. In the process, we have known that he has sacrificed a huge amount personally and business-wise in order to carry out that responsibility. He has devoted himself to it with great passion and vigour, and he has become perhaps one of the world's leading spokesmen on behalf of the rights of migrants.
I don't really know what I'm going to say by way of introducing this, but I'm going to make a couple of very general comments to put myself in context, I suppose, in a way. I believe that in the post-World War II world, that there were a number of things that happened which were the direct result of the appalling events which had preceded that time in the late 40s. And they were attempts which have defined in many ways, I would like to think, my own life. And they were based upon a belief in the integration of people and regions. Therefore, I believe, for an example, that the European integration process, which is challenged by the migration issue, as we all know, and which was created by a small group of men after the Second World War, was based upon a concept which a British politician described as the taming of nationalism. And I believe in the taming of nationalism. I've seen too much of it in my own country, and I've seen it elsewhere. And at the same time, a number of other steps were taken, one of which was the Refugee Convention in 1951, which was a direct result of the enormity of the horrible events of World War II. And everybody knows the famous story of the St. Louis, the ship that left Hamburg carrying Jewish refugees, which was turned away in many places and ended up bringing, unfortunately, some back who perished. And refugees became then a moral cause. They should have been a moral cause earlier, but they weren't. And refugees is a key element, but not the only element, in the mobility of people, which is challenged and which is now the subject matter of so much political debate and concern. I'm going to focus more on Europe than anywhere else, but the same arguments could be advanced in respect of the Andaman Sea. They could be advanced in respect of, for an example, Myanmar and those who have fled from Myanmar, and in many other places. The Pacific Ocean and the Americas have their own challenges, including the United States of America, which incidentally, looking at the number of refugees per capita taken in the United States, the figures are pathetic. So the United States doesn't have a particularly high place at the moment in the number of countries which have taken large numbers of refugees in this situation. As we know, there are over 500,000 dead in Syria. There are currently 60 million people in the world displaced. There are 20 million refugees. And of the refugees, 60% of them are in 10 countries. Proximity seems to define responsibility. If you're unlucky enough to live in the Lebanon, or in Jordan, or in Turkey, you take far more refugees than anybody else per capita. in the European Union, the Greeks take by far the most. And as we collectively and rapidly develop razor wire fences right up through the Balkans, and as our borders, following the collapse in 1989 of the Iron Curtain, are re-erected, not merely in Central and Eastern Europe, but right across Europe with the possible collapse of Schengen, one of the great achievements of the European Union, we create a situation where rapidly Greece will become a vast internment camp for refugees. Lesbos at the moment is taking in 4,000 a day. And these people are traveling across the Mediterranean in rickety boats at enormous cost and threat to their own lives. And we've seen the thousands who have drowned. We have seen the awful pictures of children lying on beaches. And the Greeks are left with the situation, and Europe is left with the situation, and the world is left with the situation that as these thousands arrive from Turkey, generally, because that's the route that they take from Syria, we say, we've had enough. All over Europe, people are saying, we've had enough. Xenophobia is on the rise. People like Trump are making similar arguments about migrants more generally in the United States. This is our land, is the refrain. And in the Greek situation, just to take it as an example, what are the alternatives open in regard to the refugees? Send them back out to sea so they drown, leave them on the beaches or in the freezing rivers of the Balkans, intern them in a huge camp, which is gradually, and not too gradually at that, taking place, or do we welcome them? We have 540 million people in the richest part of the world. We're talking about 1 million people a year. You can work out the percentages yourselves that this would require. Of course, they all want to go to some countries rather than others. They'd all like to go to Germany because Germany's GDP and its unemployment rate, and indeed its demographic profile, shows that there is an open opportunity. Many of them want to go to England and Britain, not merely because Britain has had a fairly buoyant economy, but I think, having visited Calais, which was one of the more notorious camps, and spoken to many of them, largely because, in the case of England, they speak English. As Mrs. Merkel has said, this is beginning to pose an existential issue for the European Union, which I believe to be the most noble political movement in the history of Europe for 1,000 years. Because it is about taming nationalism, and because it's about sharing sovereignty. Of course, at the same time, we have the aggravating factors, such as Brexit, the debate of Britain leaving the European Union. We have the borders that are being recreated around Europe. We have the austerity which some blame on Europe in terms of economic policy and so on, but I won't go into all of that. I dug out a few figures last night. Between January and November 2015, Sweden took, and I'm just talking about refugees, 14,328. Ireland took 637. UK took 531, and the US took 379. This is a pretty horrific indictment and an expression of the differences between different countries and their response to this. To my mind, Mrs. Merkel has been a hero. I was standing beside her in Malta when we had a conference with Africa not too long ago, and I whispered in her ear, "You're a hero." And she said, "Why?" And I said, you're a hero because you've expressed a moral vision at your own political cost. And she said, I can't remember, I should have written down the words, but she in effect said, what can Europe do in this situation but open? And she's right, and she is suffering. So we have a huge moral issue, and we have a defining issue for our generation, in my view. And as proximity should not define responsibility, it's a global responsibility. Why should the US be less responsible for the migrants and refugees than Greece? Why should Lebanon have a quarter of its population refugees? Or why should Jordan have 635,000? Or why should Turkey have 2.6 million? As we sit and pontificate in other parts of the world. At the same time, we have the dilemma and the promise of our democratic ideals. And our peoples are saying no more. How does one equate this democratic belief and the obligation of politicians, obviously, to respond to democracy with the moral responsibility that rests upon us in regard to refugees? Well, to my mind, and it may be a simplistic answer, one answer to that is that if you have politicians who won't lead, then you can expect xenophobia. If you have politicians who will not confront racism and xenophobia, then you'll get more of it. If you've nobody who's prepared to stand up and say that the objective evidence is that migrants add to growth, which it is, there, clear and unambiguous, that they accept and take less by way of benefits than they contribute by way of tax, that they have lower unemployment rates all over the world. If you're not prepared to say that, then you reap what you sow. Of course, xenophobia will develop. Of course, the inherent racism that we all suffer from, including the new countries, which are themselves created out of an immigrant community. George Orwell, I think, made the comment once about racism and about nationalism, that nationalism, in the end of the day, is thinking you're better than somebody else. And in a strange sort of way, scratch the surface and we all think it, to a greater or lesser extent. Logically, we may reject it. Morally, we may reject it. But when Ireland hopefully trumps England tomorrow in Twickenham, I can tell you, I will not be cheering for England. So there's no easy way out of this, but rational argument, rational debate, and the expression of opinion by those who, in the European context, I know it's a different word here, aspire to a liberal society. And that's what I aspire to. That's what I believe the Charter of the United Nations aspires to. That's what the treaties of the European Union aspire to. So either we're going to duck down and accept the outrageous statements made by some prime ministers in Europe, for an example, yes, we'll take refugees as long as they're Christians. What in God's name, what century are we living in? What do we say to those who say now that they are going to confront the European Court of Justice by having a referendum to reject a European law? Hallstein, the first great president of the European Commission, said that Europe is founded on law and respect for the law and the rights of man. If the respect for the law goes, unlike the time of Hitler or Napoleon, we don't rely upon divisions. We rely on principles and we rely on law. So, to my mind, the challenge that we face is the supreme challenge of our time, we Europeans particularly, and we're not rising to it. All over Europe, politicians are ducking under the eiderdown. They're kowtowing to a type of articulation that is a rejection of the very principles that the post-World War II era that I started with should have created. And I think we have to do something about it. And that's why I'm here.
Thank you very much. I'm Matthew Rycroft, the British Ambassador to the United Nations. I did want to draw attention to the words behind you, which under Carnegie Council it says the voice for ethics in international policy. And I think that you have made a very clear, cogent and compelling voice for ethics. I'm wondering if in order to change the dynamic that you have criticised in the decision making of many prime ministers and presidents, if there's a way of redefining ambition and generosity in this area, so it isn't just about resettlement and relocation, but that other contributions towards resolving either the issue or the underlying causes of the issue, including the Syria conflict and others in the Middle East and North Africa, if that sort of counts as a valuable contribution to the debate, and if you could then try and create some competition between countries to be doing the right thing, but give them a relatively broad definition of what the right thing is, they don't all have to do more on resettlement. Thank you.
Well, I can't deny that, and nor can I deny the fact that the UK has made a very substantial contribution in terms of the financial support and the thinking about, on some of the points that have been made earlier about trade, for an example, trade zones in Jordan or wherever where refugees can be employed and so on, and also direct financial contribution. And of course, everything you say is absolutely accurate. But I do think that there is a real problem here, because if you look at a country which has been extremely generous, two of them, the two most generous, Sweden, number one, and Germany, number two. If Germany is taking in 800,000 to 1 million a year, and if you hear, as I have heard in public discourse in Germany, somebody standing up in the audience and saying, why are we the ones who are taking X, whereas country Y is taking a fraction, then inevitably the result of that comparison is a politically toxic mix for Mrs. Merkel or for Sweden. So I don't think that there's any way of ducking the issue of taking numbers which are on a broadly equivalent basis there. Otherwise, we end up, as we're seeing in Sweden, with the Democrat Party, an extremist party coming up, and it's happening all over Europe. At least the politicians who are taking more have some chance of winning the battle if they can say, Europe, we believe in solidarity, we believe in sharing, and we're all playing by the same rules. At the moment, we're not.
Ron Berenbaum, can you draw a political or legal distinction between refugees and migrants, and how this discussion should be conducted separately as between?
Well, that's a vital question, and I didn't mention it because it opened something up which is absolutely vital. I'm glad in fact, that you asked it, because refugees are people who are basically escaping from persecution. Now, there's another huge category of migrants, vulnerable migrants, whose lives can be at risk for a whole series of reasons which are not related to persecution or even war. It could be famine, it could be anything. And they're just as much at risk as those who are escaping from Syria. So how do we work out a regime for that? And that is something that in the conference of the 19th of September, which will be taking place, we're going to have to look at. We can't ignore it. I think that the way to deal with it is, first of all, to maintain sacrosanct the convention. Build a fence around that. Now, the Danish Prime Minister wants to open that. To my mind, that is utterly unacceptable, because if that definition of persecuted people is being opened, you can be damn sure it's not being opened to expand it. So we stay away from that, and nobody should touch it. On the others, I think we have to work out a regime which allows for various different solutions. For an example, humanitarian visas, closely associated with humanitarian disasters, temporary visas, family reunion issues. We have to work out a global regime that actually works in some way. What we can't profess, whatever our beliefs may be, is we cannot profess a belief in open borders that will be politically acceptable. It won't be. So many economic migrants will have no rights to stay. They should be respected, they should be dealt with respect, and their human rights should be supported. But the open border idea of simply letting everybody move, however much some of us may argue along those lines, is not a tenable situation.
Thank you very much. E. Peterson, the permanent representative to the UN for Denmark. You allegedly quoted my prime minister. What he has said also is that there's a lot of misunderstandings of what is going on in Denmark. One fact is that, for instance, we took in 20,000 refugees last year. If the US, relatively speaking, had taken in the same amount, it would be around 1 million compared to population and so on. The question I really had was already pointed to the link or the migration issue, because it is indeed a summit about migration and refugee. And we have had previous summits about migration, and you have been special representative on migration for the past 10 years, but somehow we never really started to grapple with that, really. And it's in a way sometimes very diffuse if you look at what is the discussion is. So, because at the moment, otherwise we will only talk about the refugees. The migration issue is actually the long-term issue about how many refugees we will have in the future.
It's fair. First of all, let me be fair to Denmark. The actual numbers taken by Denmark, as the ambassador has cited, are admirable and have been amongst the highest, and on occasion the highest in the European Union. That's true. With regard to what may be expressed as a criticism of the international system not to have organized systemically a response to this type of situation, a structure for migrants in crisis, which is an initiative currently being led by the United States and the Philippines, which is a very important thing, which I haven't the time to go into. The reality is, when I was appointed, I remember meeting Ambassador Bolton. It wasn't a pleasant meeting. He said to me, what are you talking about migration in the UN for? You've no right to talk about it. And we're not going to participate in what was then a high-level dialogue before the General Assembly, which I was meant to be orchestrating in some way. We're not going to even turn up. As far as we're concerned, this is a question of national sovereignty. I'm paraphrasing him. We've got our constitution, we've got our laws, we've got our rights. We don't need lectures from you or from anyone else. Well, I told him, well, I thought of him too. And it was a rather unpleasant meeting. But it was indicative of an approach which you will find in many places. And that's why there isn't an international regime for migrants in crisis, vulnerable migrants, we've very little law. The Refugee Convention is one of the exceptions, because many countries say, hands off. This is national sovereignty. We'll organize what we're going to do in the US. And one of the reasons why I think this year is the moment of multilateral response to last year's and this year's crisis is that we have an administration which will be engaged with the issue as long as President Obama is where he is. There are moments of time when things can happen, and this is the moment of time when it'll either happen or it won't. If we have a new administration next year, how many years does it take for it to get its act together, even if it isn't automatically anti-migrant? We can imagine the crisis just going on without any multilateral response. So this is the moment. We have a fantastic leader of the IOM, an American, Bill Swing, great guy, plays tennis every morning at the age of 81, fantastic character, and we have a great leader, new leader of UNHCR. We have a Secretary General who's interested and committed, and a Deputy Secretary General, Eliasson, who's equally committed. So we try.
Thank you very, very much. For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio.